Our final speaker for this session is Diane Gwilt, National Museum of Wales, Keeper of Collection Services. There we go.
Okay, so Simon said in his opening remarks that ethics stand above the law but must operate within the law. So how do conservation ethics work when you decide to comply with, rather than subvert, legislation, and pontification is not an option? In its recent Round 2 Heritage Lottery Fund bid for the redevelopment of St Fagans National History Museum, Amgueddfa Cymru, National Museum of Wales, has signed up to delivering a participatory museum. So loosely, this translates as creating more active experiences, which in turn means allowing things to be climbed on, things to be operated, things to be touched. So, whilst this might worry some of you, you can build ethical frameworks to manage the risks inherent in such interactivity. And here is an example of a typical ethical framework for conservation. So, how resilient are these frameworks when the overriding concern is legislative compliance? So, dating from around 1900, this saddle tank loco was used in Pal Dyffryn's and then the NCB's collieries in South Wales. It was donated to the museum in 1971 and restored in around 1980 by Work Experience Programme for display at the now closed Welsh Industrial and Maritime Museum in Cardiff Bay. Since the closure of the museum in 1998, the loco has moved a couple of times but has finally come to rest at Big Pit, where it continues to be kept outside. The boiler shrouding has slowly deteriorated, exposing the asbestos boiler lagging. The Control of Asbestos Regulations 2006 placed a duty on organisations to take reasonable steps to find out where they have asbestos, to assess the risk, and have in place plans to manage the risk. This slide shows the locomotive following the first phase of asbestos removal, which resulted in the loss of the lower part of the boiler shrouding, thus exemplifying the point Jane made in her introduction, that criticisms of ethical outcomes are really a criticism of criteria. We need to remove the asbestos as soon as possible to stop the magpies making nests out of it. We have yet to resolve how to get this boiler shrouding replaced. The second phase of the work, which placed the retention of the original fabric at its core, has just been completed, enabling a rolling programme of conservation and maintenance to be initiated. Interestingly, the difference in cost between the ethical and a non-ethical approach is not significant, which picks up Simon's point about ethics and resources. This is part of the 103-metre-long De Winton line shaft at the National Slate Museum in Llanberis. It was installed when the workshops first came into use in the 1870s. It is the only one of its type in existence. Under the Provision and Use of Work Equipment Regulations 1998, or PUA, the operation of equipment should not result in health and safety risks, regardless of its age, condition, or origin. A firm of consulting engineers was called in earlier this year to determine the condition of each bearing, of which there are 20. Their recommendation was that the use of the line shaft for demonstrative purposes should be avoided until the bearings have been repaired. I think this slide here demonstrates how worn they are. The engineers attributed the distortion of the line shaft seen in this plan to either settlement of the building or wear of the bearings, hence their further recommendation that the line shaft should also be levelled. There is a drop of about 6 inches along its length, but no signs of settlement in the building to the same extent. Further, as many of the bearings are embedded in the walls, it is not unreasonable to assume that the line shaft is actually in its original position, i.e. it was never level in the first place. Whilst a decision has been made to replace the bearings, to level or not to level is still the question. This mounted specimen of a bison, which forms part of our Evolution of Wales gallery at the National Museum Cardiff, dates from about 1900. It is therefore more likely than not that it has been insect-proofed with arsenical soap. Under COSH, exposure to substances covered by the regulation should either be prevented or, where this is not reasonably practical, adequately controlled. Despite the placing of do not touch signs, around the specimen, the inevitable happens, with the consequences shown here. Two options presented themselves: adequately control the problem by casing the specimen, or prevent exposure by removing the specimen and replacing it with a more recently preserved mount. Whilst casing would have been easier, it would have had a negative impact on the gallery, where the emphasis is on open display where possible. The department took the decision to source a new mount, which is not as easy as it sounds. Borax and a good IPM have replaced arsenical soap. To quote Jonathan Ashley Smith, the department have recognised the risk but seen the benefit of the controlled destruction that will inevitably arise from open display. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. Kieran's going to respond to that.
In terms of legislation that's used to dictate the conservation process, the question has to be asked: who makes this legislation up? Who writes it? I mean, has conservation got a part in developing the legislation?
Well, the examples that I've shown, certainly the asbestos regulations, museums quite often get caught up. It's the law of unintended consequences. I mean, the Human Tissue Act is another example where museums, when the legislation is drafted, the legislation is not drafted with museum collections or museums in mind at all, but it is the law of unintended consequences that we eventually get caught up in them. I mean, radiation's another one, REACH, which deals with the movement of chemicals, is another example. And these are all examples that are current, that I've had recent experience of having to sort of deal with in relationship to museum collections.
Would it be beneficial to have a way to bridge the gap between legislation and the needs of the object in terms of conservation, and have kind of a meet halfway kind of
It's really quite difficult, because at the end of the day, certainly with things like the asbestos regulations, they are absolute. You have to comply with them. You know, there is not a wiggle, there is not a get out, because asbestos is deemed to be sufficiently dangerous that it really, it's, you cannot wriggle out of absolute regulation. So all you can do is try and interpret the legislation in a reasonable way, and that's where kind of a conservation ethical framework comes into play. Is how do you apply legislation which is designed to control the activities of builders, renovating buildings, to a collection of that contains asbestos in many different forms. We have a very large collection of asbestiform minerals, which no one really quite knows what to do. But we've taken the decision that we really need to, we need to treat them as if they are covered by the regulations, because the risks to the organisation of not doing that are huge. Health and safety inspectors are not known for their their tolerance. If you're not complying with the regulations, then they can, make your life very difficult.
Okay, it's prosecutable basically. This comes to the point that as an officer, either you or somebody else. There is no choice. We have a question or response from the front here.
Do with you.
Jack Kirby from Think Tank in Birmingham. I'm interested that we're framing this debate around the legislation and not actually safety, because. Yes, the legislation, I have to deal with HTA, I have to deal with IRR, asbestos, everything as well. But it also concerns me that there are anecdotally instances out there, and indeed in some cases we can point at prosecution by the Health and Safety Executive, where people have been injured in museums. And shouldn't that actually be our first concern, that these things are safe? That yes, compliance with the legislation, absolutely, but to give an example, a large museum in the north of England was prosecuted because a child was injured by an interactive exhibit where the guarding had been broken for some weeks or months. And now, they weren't complying with the legislation, but moreover, there was a disregard for public safety. With steam museums, there are some terrible stories about people using domestic pipework with high-pressure steam going through it. Mm-hmm. My concern is really that the place is safe and that I can sleep at night, Yes, I have to comply with the legislation as well, but that's second to the public safety angle.
But part of the public safety is complying with the legislation, because if somebody was to be, I mean, it's, so far it's not happened, but if someone was to become ill because they really liked the bison and they, picked up a lot of arsenical products off it, which made them very seriously ill, then the first question that we would be asked is, what are you doing to manage the risk under the health and safety, under the relevant regulations? So I understand what you're saying, but you can't actually divorce the two things. You can't say, well, we were doing everything we were doing the best we could, but we weren't doing it in the context of the legislation. That's the point, is that it is absolutely, with a lot of these things, it absolutely drives through, the management decisions that are made are completely controlled by that issue.
I think it's a very good point you make, Jack, because one way we could look at this is that an ethical framework and guidelines for a museum or conservation professional could actually state the fact that actually public safety comes before the care of the object effectively, absolutely. And actually you should not just look at legislative requirements, but actually you should look at all risks to the viewing public or the people that use the object.
But I mean, legislative requirements are generally built around, well, this type of legislative requirements are generally built around, ensuring safety of people. I mean, that's what drives them.
Do we have any more comments, responses from the floor? Down the front here. Would you take the microphone? Thank you.
Brilliant. Peter Collington at Waterways Trust. I was just wondering when you talked about, particularly asbestos, but I think it's including the bison, but has it actually stopped you from interpreting or displaying any of your objects going through this legislative process?
Yes. I'll be the straightforward answer to that. And I'm not going to talk about those. I can't talk about some of the situations, but we are particularly sensitive about these issues in the National Museum at the moment because of we have been prohibited from doing certain things because we have got caught up in the coattails of various types of legislation. So yes, it does.
Does that impinge on the actual learning experience?
It potentially completely restricts the use of certain parts of our collections.
Okay, we have a final response from the back.
Hi, Chris.
Hi, it's Chris Knapp again. Just two brief points. I'd just like to point out the HSC are not always the ogres we tend to believe them to be. And my favourite ploy is to phone the local inspector and ask him to come in and give me advice. They would rather work with you than against you. It's easier to work with you than it is to prosecute you. But getting back to the care of our objects, what I find is when it's within the conservation area of control, we don't have a problem. It's when other departments such as commercial or visitor services want to do something with the objects, we have a problem. And I've managed to instigate a system of object risk assessments as opposed to task risk assessments. And then they've got to justify the risk they want to put the object to.
Okay, can we... there is a hazards conference coming up where these could be more readily discussed, I think. But what I need to do is say thank you very much, Diane. Thank you very much to all our speakers. We are